diversity. That's all. Okay, so welcome to the Quant University's seminar, primarily focusing on risks, opportunities with large language models and ChatGPT. So people who are attending in person, welcome. It's always nice to see people who are back in the offices and to see people in person. So we are in the CFA Boston Society offices here in Boston. It's a beautiful day outside, and people who are here, you have the opportunity to mingle and network, and we're going to have more of these sessions over the year in the CFA Boston offices. And people who are online, if you are in the Boston locality, the next time you join us, feel free to register for the in-person attendance. We will have lunch for you here. So if you are coming for the lunch and learn, and also if you're online, I'm sorry, you will miss the amazing lunch we have in here, but we will send you the recordings of today's session. So hopefully today's learning will help you kind of appreciate both the opportunities and the risks associated with ChatGPT and large language models. So it's a fascinating day and time we are in now. We have the NVIDIA GTC conference going on in California, and Quant University is one of the inception startups, which is fortunate to have kind of threaded the path in terms of understanding how large language models and all the other associated. Let me just turn off. So we are a part of the Inception program, and we've seen a lot of evolution of interest in both the hardware side of the story on how the GPUs have been progressing over time, and also the software stack on the possibilities of the various things we could build in. So we also have in our room Shreyas and Uddhav, who are working on cool things, AI augmented learning platforms, primarily leveraging AI for building out different things. So many of the things we're going to talk about is not only coming from the research perspective, but also some of the things we are building ourselves and some of the experience we have had as we are building out these kinds of systems. In addition to that, as some of you know, I also teach a course at Northeastern University, primarily in the Masters in Information Systems program. So we've been leveraging large language models and productionizing various aspects of how do you think about taking these systems and scaling it in the enterprise. So we're teaching our students various aspects. So the students are going through their fourth assignment. So every assignment is a layer of complexity we add to the equation. So we are seeing students kind of enjoy building out these applications, but also looking at well, it doesn't work. So what else do we need to do to kind of make it work? So today, what I'm going to do is give you a preview of a full day workshop we are planning to do on April the 16th. And that's going to be held in the CFA Boston offices. But I wanted to kind of give you some highlights on the risks and opportunities associated with ChatGPT and associated models. So before I forget, let me record this session. So people who are online, welcome to the program. I know we have been having the Quant University guest lecture series for a long time, since our COVID days, if you will. And unfortunately, we have had to stop some of those sessions. But good news, we are going to be bringing it back again. And hopefully in the next week or two, if you have signed up for our mailing list, you will get an email about all the cool sessions which you're going to see in the near future. And today we are going to primarily focus on ChatGPT, large language models, risks and opportunities. So if you have any questions for today, please put them in the chat window, and we will give you the last 10-15 minutes to ask her any questions, and hopefully we'll be able to answer them for you. So most of you are familiar with our offerings at Quant University. So we are primarily an analytics advisory. We are based out of Boston, and we started this 10 years ago. We primarily focus on the intersection of data science, machine learning, and finance. We work with large asset management companies, retirement funds, insurance companies, helping them bridge the gap between building systems, leveraging big data, frontier technologies, fintech-related products, and integrating it with their established workflows. Artificial intelligence risk and evaluating models is becoming more and more important nowadays, especially with all the complexity and the black box models which are out there. So we are building out different programs to help facilitate the learning and the understanding of the capabilities of these models. And we also teach these aspects both at Quant University and also in some of the programs I teach at Northeastern University. So I want to kind of motivate this discussion with a few examples on ChatGPT. That way you're familiar with, if you have never used ChatGPT, you can try it out in your leisure. The first one is a case study we actually did live in the classroom late last year here in Boston. So we had a lot of analysts from Fidelity and various other places attend this program. And we also had, a couple of RIAs in the room. So we kind of, took it as a case study. So how about we put together a letter for a potential high net worth investor, and we want to invite them to a meeting, and we know a little bit about them. So we know that, this investor is planning to retire in 10 years and has 2 kids who are ready to go to college in 2 or 3 years. This person also has a chronic health condition which requires significant medical expenditure in short notice, which means that there needs to be some liquidity in the portfolio. And we wanted to kind of have these incorporated, also give a little bit of market summary and personalize this letter to send out to this particular investor. So we just kind of, polled the room on what does it take to create a letter like this. And the answers varied, but most people were kind of talking about in the ballpark of 3 to 4 hours to kind of do some research, put together a nice letter, draft it out, and then, shoot it out kind of a thing. So we just said, okay, how about we just provide this as a prompt to ChatGPT and create a letter? And we got a draft within a few minutes, and most people agreed that this was a decent enough draft. It may not be like the most optimal one, but it's a really good first draft to kind of, start out with, and it just increases the productivity so much as you're kind of building out these abstractions without having to kind of, build everything from scratch. Another example, document summarization. So I gave a talk at the Enrolled Actuarial Conference last week in Washington, D.C., and we had a whole webpage wherein they talked about like the various sessions which were happening there. And I wanted to personalize a letter to send out to some of the people I knew and invite them to attend this particular session. And I want to just highlight like 3 important things you're going to take away as you, if you want to attend this particular conference. So I just basically gave some very few sentences as prompts, and I got a really nice, more or less close to final draft of letter, which I could use to be sending it out to people to invite them to a conference. So as you can see, these patterns of productivity, if you will, you have a digital assistant which you could use, and you could basically enhance your productivity, especially if you're going to be working with clients, if you're going to be formally sending out letters of invitations, et cetera, et cetera. And the third example is my favorite. It's being dad. And as most of you know, everybody has access to ChatGPT now, so we're kind of playing around with the possibilities. So my 6th graders, we were coming back from a swim class and on a Sunday evening, and she said, "Oh, tomorrow morning I have a science test," and completely forgot about it. And we were like, "Well, we're going to have dinner and sleep. I don't know if we'll have time for preparation for a science quiz." And I asked her what the topic is, and she mentioned it's electromagnetic radiation. It's like, well, I'm driving, it's another 45 minutes. So how can I kind of just pull out concepts of electromagnetic radiation and give her, some insights? So I actually had ChatGPT Plus on my phone. So I fired it up and I said, well, review the Massachusetts 6th grade syllabus and look at electromagnetic radiation and put together a lesson on a tutorial on electromagnetic radiation. And what you see on the left is basically a summary, and it was a verbal transcript. It actually spoke out in the car radio. It gave out like a nice introduction to electromagnetic radiation. And after that, I said, well, how about you create a quiz based on the concepts you just presented and have like 3 options. And once you get the answer, verify if the answer is correct answer or wrong. If not, give the correct answer. And it actually generated a quiz, and it went through each one of these questions and said like, oh, question 1, question 2, question 3. And then she was sitting at the back and she was answering these questions. And we gamified the whole experience. I mean, 45 minutes just went by. And guess what? Next day, she went to the test and she got an A in the test. And she loved the whole experience. So, I mean, just to give you an example of the possibilities which are out there. And formally, we are doing something similar at Quant University. We're actually building the next generation of AI augmented learning systems, wherein we want to personalize the learning so that you can actually test out your knowledge and also adapt it to the required skills you need for your particular job or for your particular thing. So how many of you, when you took your CFA exams, read through these 10,000 pages worth of material? So, we kind of average out 300 hours per level kind of a thing, close to 1,000 hours worth of investment. But after the exams, we just forget about the whole thing. We just kind of either give away those books or just put them on the shelf and never open it. So the notion is like knowledge needs to be in your fingertips. If it's not available when you need it, then it's absolutely useless. So how do you leverage these systems to build out, infrastructure so that whenever you need, I need to evaluate private equity, I need a quick refresher on how do we evaluate private equity. I need to evaluate bonds of a particular kind. How do you evaluate these kinds of bonds? So we want to kind of create those systems wherein you have information at your fingertips. I'll talk a little bit about it later. But the possibilities are many, right? So we are now at an age wherein we can actually engineer these systems to do interesting things. And that's because of this whole notion of large language models, which we are kind of seeing not only becoming a technological artifact, which only a few people can access, it's becoming ubiquitous so that everybody has access to the technology and you can actually work with certain things. So I'll motivate it with an example. So this is Elon Musk sending out a tweet in 2018. And people in the financial industry, we're always news-driven, right? So we basically are always plugged into the world. We always have our Bloomberg terminals in front of us. We are looking at like what's actually happening, which is going to drive the markets today. So in 2018, Elon Musk sends out a tweet saying he wants to take Tesla private. That was 9:48 California time. And then Bloomberg later posted out this graph, and they talked about the market impact. Within a few minutes, that information had been adopted and trades had already been placed and the price had already been reflected of this particular tweet. So within, it is 12:48 in New York when this particular thing happened. The point I'm trying to make is like, there's no way a human can sit and access that information and say, okay, now I'm going to execute a trade on this. So you have algorithmically driven systems which are constantly plugged into these information sources, and it's able to take decisions. And now that we have large language models which have the ability to understand these news items, and you can basically, at a very fast pace, evaluate what it is. So you can program systems at a much higher level in terms of taking decisions on your behalf, because of the possibilities which we are seeing today. And you can plug it into various kinds of systems, and that's impossible for humans to just go in and do it on our own. So we have these machines which are really good at doing things because it's connected to the web and it can process a large amount of information. And we also have humans who are really good at decision-making and planning. So how do we kind of combine both these talents to kind of make interesting things possible? A lot of companies are seeing there are opportunities primarily to increase revenue or to decrease costs because of these advances. And we are seeing, a lot of new innovations happening, not only from a technical perspective, but companies are thinking about using these methodologies and building intellectual property so that they can solve interesting problems. And that's reflected in the graphs in here. So here what we are seeing is you're seeing an interesting you're seeing an amazing trend in terms of interest in AI and machine learning related publications. Things like neural networks, support vector machines, rule-based learning, deep learning, et cetera, has taken off in the last 5+ years or so. For me, the more interesting part is this blue line, which is the patent families. Companies are not only looking at it as a research topic, they're actually building it as a differentiator. They're building patent portfolios saying that, well, this is not just a technical innovation, it's something which can innovatively solve a particular business problem, and they're filing patents associated with that. So we're going to see a lot more of this as we go, because companies are now realizing that these technologies are really beneficial from a business perspective. And what that means is all the companies which you are aware of are hiring primarily data scientists and machine learning professionals, because it's no longer the technology team which needs access to these kinds of skills. You're seeing these kinds of skills required in multiple levels. And most quants like myself, who got trained initially with factor models and derivative pricing and Monte Carlo simulations and the mathematical modeling related aspects. So we are also now expanding our skills to leverage information sources, leveraging graph analytics, natural language processing, leveraging alternative data sets, sentiment analysis, deep learning, et cetera, et cetera. So these skills are not something wherein we would say, oh, it's a technologist's toolbox kind of a skill. It's more or less integrated with all our decision-making skills. Now, most people are familiar with machine learning workflows, and you typically are thinking about like machine learning as a process wherein you get some raw data, you do some feature engineering, you cleanse the data, and you build it into some kind of a structure wherein you could say, let's run some kind of a learning algorithm over it and build out a model. And once we have the model, evaluate and test, and then choose the best possible model and then deploy it. So that's typically been our workflow for building out models in the past. But now what's happening is we have this large language model revolution wherein we do not really have access to the model. We have access to an API key. So we basically, if we need to call GPT, we basically call the GPT with an API key, and we pass in whatever question we have. And you have these models which are built with billions and billions of parameters. And many times we don't even have the architecture disclosed. And we are just kind of getting back the answers from this. So we are learning a lot of new paradigms on how we work with models. So it's not going to be the case wherein we are going to start from scratch, wherein we're going to get the data and then kind of build out the whole pipeline. We are going to potentially just be leveraging models which are either deployed on the cloud, or if you're going to be using open source models like Llama, you're going to be having it hosted somewhere internally or maybe on your own private cloud, and you're going to be accessing it through some kind of an API. So that has changed the way we think about the way we use and interact with models. And that's led to this whole revolution of prompts which people are trying out. They try interesting questions and they get back answers, and they complain like, oh, it did not give me the right answer. Sometimes it gave me the right answer, sometimes it did not give me the right answer. So you're seeing this whole interesting paradigm of we are moving away from traditional statistical modeling, programming, but now we are thinking about leveraging these models to get interesting insights. And we are seeing this whole explosion of possibilities and design patterns. In fact, there is a prompt marketplace. So prompts are basically commands we give to a model. So it's no longer the case wherein we are just providing a bunch of factors and getting back a response. We are asking an English question with some specific context and with specific data and asking the model to respond back with an answer. And these are basically prompts. And you are thinking about, I would never, initially when the prompts got, introduced, I was talking about like, oh, there will be in the near future a master's in prompt engineering, a graduate degree wherein you'll formally read and understand how to write interesting prompts. And that's kind of becoming close to reality because of the complexity of these prompts and the way of design patterns, the way things are going. But you have a prompt marketplace. So if I wanted to get a picture and say I want to have a picture in a Picasso style, I could buy a prompt for $2.99 and then use that prompt to basically create a picture of a particular style of an artist. So you're seeing this whole revolution of prompts coming in. And Andrew Karpati, who was one of the pioneers, he's also He was also at OpenAI till recently. So he talked about like the hottest programming language today is English. That's a very, very, profound statement. Because when you talk about programming, it was always something wherein you had to learn as a skill, and you primarily had the technology departments who were primarily the coders, and the business requirements had to come to the coders in a particular format, and the whole department would actually implement it. But today you have this whole democratization. Anybody who can speak English can basically build out a prototype by specifying what they intend to do. You want to generate some code, you want to generate a particular graph, you want to summarize certain things, you want to understand the sentiments of certain things, you want to extract certain keywords. So all these natural language tasks, which are something which you can express with English, is possible. And that has led to this whole democratization of innovation, where marketing is now thinking about innovation. Legal is now thinking about innovation. HR is thinking about innovation. Customer service is thinking about innovation. So when you think about a function within a financial industry, not one place has been left untouched, because everybody is now thinking about how can we leverage and innovate these methodologies as we kind of progress through the organization. And OpenAI and ChatGPT are not the only companies. You're seeing a plethora of new offerings, like companies like Google have Gemini, and you have Llama, Mistral, Perplexity, and all these other companies which are kind of working on interesting things. And also companies like Salesforce, they are augmenting their existing offerings on CRM and other things and leveraging generative AI to do interesting things. In fact, yesterday, Snowflake announced their partnership with Mistral.ai. So a lot of companies are now adding an AI layer to their existing products. And what that means is we are in this wild west, wherein we are thinking about building out all these technologies, but currently we do not have any regulations which basically are saying you should be doing this or you should not be doing this. And that's extremely important when we are in the financial industry, especially because we are probably one of the most regulated of industries. We have the fiduciary responsibility to make sure that we are doing our due diligence as we kind of, build out our, models, and we take care of our clients. And there is no specific legal requirement yet. I mean, we are seeing frameworks come out, like NIST has put out some frameworks, EU has an EU AI Act, but we still do not have legislation. And we are seeing a lot of interest in legislation, at least in the United States. So we are seeing a lot of large companies already building out frameworks and trying to influence the regulation. So you have the Googles of the world, the OpenAIs of the world, the Microsofts of the world, who are probably the only people who have enough data to create these large language models. So they are the companies who are kind of putting out different frameworks on what's possible and how AI should be regulated. But you're also seeing, financial companies kind of being cautious about it. I mean, if you talk to people in the financial industry, you can hear that a lot of people are experimenting, but not a lot of products are in production yet. And the reason is there's the concern about hallucination, about like where could things go wrong? If I don't really understand the model, where can things go wrong? And how do I make sure that it doesn't happen? It's a reputation risk. There is a lot of different kinds of risks which are possible in here. So companies are building out their own internal policies to make sure that you're not only addressing the concerns which are out there, but you're also making sure that your employees follow certain procedures, because you don't want to like upload all your PDF documents to ChatGPT and say, okay, summarize this, because now you're sending out all your proprietary data onto the cloud. So obviously there is a lot of interest, and NIST is one of the standardization organizations which has put out a whole framework. And we in the financial industry are probably the first to more or less adopt some kind of a really good framework for risk evaluation for models. There is a publication called SR 11.7, which is used by most banks and large companies for model risk management. And it talks about the various tenets of how do we manage risks associated with models. And we are seeing a lot of similar ideas being incorporated into this whole area of artificial intelligence risk management. But there is also a lot of interesting innovations which we should also think about. Like, Morgan Stanley talked about their innovation wherein they can take their private documents, all the data they had, and they had put together a tool wherein analysts could go and research these documents and extract information out of it. So information at their fingertips. A lot of insurance companies are trying to do interesting things because they have a lot of user-related data, behavioral data, and trying to understand those. And customer service is another area wherein you're probably going to interface first with a chatbot rather than a human. And most likely, if it's a regular question, you may get an answer rather than waiting in a queue for 45 minutes. So you're seeing a lot of interesting innovations happening out there. And there are a lot of specialized innovations happening too. For example, Bloomberg has their own GPT called as Bloomberg GPT, and it's integrated as a part of their suite where you can query Bloomberg on specific things, and you could, instead of you learning those acronyms to figure out what particular asset and what particular screen to pull out, you could potentially express that in English in the near future. But a lot of companies like Tableau and Snowflake and all these other companies are building out interesting ways in which you can interface with their platforms. And when it comes down to using documents, there are a lot of interesting insights you could use, understanding tables, understanding various aspects, and you can build out a lot of interesting applications. So before we can kind of just delve into some of the details, I want to give you a quick technical overview of what does it mean when you talk about a large language model and GPT. It's not going to be, an in-depth overview. I just want to give you some basics so that you understand why it is a complex thing, and it's not as simple as ChatGPT, wherein you just ask a question and you get back an answer. You need to understand what actually happens under the hood so that you can appreciate why people are interested in this particular technology. So the first thing to note is we have what's called as a foundation model. And this basically means that you require a large amount of unlabeled data sets. And only companies like Google or Microsoft who have been scraping the web can potentially get access to it. There's no way you and I can buy a computer and say, okay, I'm going to build a foundation model from scratch. You require a lot of resources to train this with unlabeled data sets. So that's something you got to know. And I put in some links, and I'll also share the slides so you can go in and review some of these details for these models. So the next thing to understand is, what is a large language model? So natural language processing has evolved over time, right? So you are seeing ChatGPT is probably not the first natural language processing model. And before that, there was BERT and a lot of other models you could potentially use. But their capabilities were restricted. So you could potentially predict a few characters, maybe even a few words, but forming really large sentences or paragraphs was not possible with the older models. So what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years or so is we have these generic models or large language models, which can do multiple tasks, not just specialized in one particular task. It can potentially do multiple tasks. And this is kind of the reason being there is this whole area of what I call as generative AI models. And here we are basically leveraging prompts to generate new text. So what we are trying to do is we have this model, which is not just a database like a concept wherein I'm asking a question and retrieving an answer. There is no answer behind the scenes. So we are asking a question, and you are basically generating the answer, and the model is generating that particular answer for you. So there is no real database which is being used to pull up an answer. So it's the next token predictor. So you're sending a bunch of tokens, and it's a predictive model which is predicting the next set of tokens. But it's doing it intelligently so that when you get back your responses and you take your tokens and convert it back into English or any other language, you're seeing a logical sequence of words, and leveraging pattern matching, it's becoming more and more conversant with how humans speak, and it's able to generate answers in human-like form. So it's basically a generative AI system, which is kind of giving you back the answers. And the GPT, which is basically the technology, so it stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformers. So this basically, and you can see the architecture, it's a really large neural network on the right in here. So for tasks like translation, classification, text generation, all these natural language processing tasks, So these models are tuned to be really good at these particular kinds of tasks. And that's when you talk about like your ChatGPT, it's basically an API you're calling with whatever text you are passing in, those gets converted into tokens. It is sent to this GPT model, and the GPT model actually transforms that and then generates the output, and that's what you're seeing as your output in your ChatGPT window. Okay, so you are going to see a lot of applications which leverage these GPTs. There is in fact a new GPT store wherein you can go and find applications like AltRails or Code Tutor or Scholar AI or whatever applications out there. So you could basically interface with these applications leveraging these prompts. And what are the kinds of things you could potentially do? So here are some examples like grammar correction or fixing bugs or classifying different kinds of text statements, explaining code, translation, summarization, specifically saying that summarize it for a particular third grader or second grader, whatever it is, extracting specific kinds of keywords. A lot of interesting applications which are out there. And there are design patterns which you could use to basically use prompts to create these tasks. So I'll share a few examples on the kinds of things you could potentially do. And again, for the experts in the room, this is meant to be an orientation session to get you excited about all these technologies. So I'm not going into depth. So we have on April 16th, we have a one-day full workshop where we'll go through the code and we'll kind of review the basics and kind of get you a better feel for it. But for today, we're just kind of keeping it high level because we know a lot of people are kind of getting oriented on these concepts for the first time. Okay, so I'll share a few examples on the kinds of things you could do from a project perspective. So the first thing I want to talk about is what's called as retrieval augmented search, retrieval augmented generation, which is probably one of the most popular use cases, if you will. When we talked about the Morgan Stanley example, they're actually using RAG to retrieve information from the PDF and other formats. So what is this retrieval augmented generation paradigm? So just imagine I wanted to kind of ask questions on content on a particular web page. Okay, so how do I go about doing it? So one way would be to just go to the website, extract all the data from that website, and then I could just ask questions on it. But who would I ask questions to? How do I kind of create that question answering paradigm, right? So in order to implement that, we can do a couple of things. I could basically take the entire text and then send it to ChatGPT and say, hey, by the way, I'm going to ask you a question, and the answer is somewhere in this text. Use this text and then bring me back an answer. So that context window probably works if your text is going to be maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs, or even up to a book or 2 books, right? Now, what in case I wanted to search through for an answer among hundreds of books? So if I wanted to find an answer and the answer is potentially there in hundreds of books, so it's very difficult for us to basically take the entire thing. And by the way, OpenAI charges whenever you send them tokens as input tokens, and then whatever they generate as a response, they charge you for that too. So it becomes a very expensive paradigm to be sending a lot of context back and forth to this engine. And it's also a lot of processing, and it takes a lot of infrastructure to actually run those queries if you're hosting it locally. So one methodology or design pattern which people have evolved is using this methodology called retrieval augmented generation. And the methodology here is, well, in case we'll take a simple example, just a simple web page we're trying to work through. And we'll take this web page and scrape the data in this web page, and then chunk it into 500 characters. I'm just picking 500 just to illustrate as an example. It could be whatever. I'll chunk it into 500 character strings. And then I'll compute what are called as embeddings. Okay, so the embeddings are reduced dimensions of this particular set of strings. And what I can potentially then do is I have a representation which represents this particular chunk of text. So if I have another chunk of text, which more or less has the same meaning, but the way it's expressed is different, most likely the embedding will be very close to the embedding of the prior paragraph. Okay, so once we have that, we can basically use what's called as a vector database to store all these embeddings. And when we get a question from a user, what we do is we basically compute the embedding of the question and then figure out, is there an embedding in my database which potentially is very close to this particular embedding? And if so, pull out that particular embedding and reverse engineer to get back the original text, and then send that text and the question to a large language model and say, hey, by the way, this is the question, and we think that there's this particular text which may have answer to it. Review it and summarize that answer for me. And you could create larger chunks too. If 500 characters is probably not the right one, you could experiment with larger ones too. So what happens at that point is you could basically build out an infrastructure and an architecture wherein you can extract those portions wherein the answers may be there and use that to communicate with your engine. Okay, so we'll go through a whole case study leveraging call transcripts to answer questions associated with financial call transcripts. And you could basically store all the call transcripts over the last many years for a company and ask questions associated with all these call transcripts without having to send the entire transcript for Q&A. Okay? So that is one design pattern a lot of companies are trying to use. Another example is basically using custom GPTs like Bloomberg GPT, which I mentioned earlier. So they have built out a 50 billion parameter model, and it's primarily built leveraging financial data. So it's fine-tuned for financial related questions. Note that if I'm going to be just scraping data from the internet, so I'm going to get a lot of different pieces of information, which may or may not be contextual to the questions I have. So you could potentially think about these very specific models for finance, for medicine, for operations. So you could basically have your own custom models to answer specific questions associated with your particular use cases. So that's actually becoming more and more popular. JP Morgan recently also talked about ChatGPT like AI service for investment advice. They also have another one called Doc LLM for multimodal document understanding when you have documents with images and tables and stuff like that. So how do I process the whole thing and then understand these kinds of documents? So you are seeing a lot of innovation happening in trying to hone these models for specific kinds of use cases. On the other hand, you're also seeing a lot of interesting innovations to have more conversational agents. So you probably already have been using it in your homes, your Siri or Alexa, etc. But you have a lot of banks and other institutions creating these new virtual agents, wherein not only it answers questions for technical support, but you can query your own account. You can ask about a particular transaction, and you could basically interact with your own accounts using these virtual agents, which enhances the experience of an end user, if you will, especially if you're going to be using devices for communication. And then this is the picture I pulled out from my class. Probably, I don't know, Uddhav, you were here. I think you must be in this picture too. You may be there. So this was a picture from my last cohort in my class, we thought. So a lot of students built interesting systems. Some students like took Shakespeare and then created comics out of it using generative AI. I think you guys did a healthcare recommendation system leveraging plan sponsor documents for various insurance plans and being able to answer questions on insurance plans. There is the style link wherein you can personalize styles based on the images you're posting. In retirement systems, there are a lot of interesting use cases wherein you have all these documents, like what is the most appropriate fund for your particular retirement horizon and based on your portfolio, etc. So there are a lot of interesting things you could potentially do with these questions. So those are some of the possibilities of building these kinds of systems. Now, there are a lot of risks involved too, and that's why you need to be aware of both the opportunities and also being able to understand the risks and seeing how you can put in guardrails to prevent those risks from kind of creating havocs within your enterprise. This is just a kind of a hierarchy of the different attacks which are possible from a security perspective for machine learning. So people in the cybersecurity world have been addressing attacks through various ways like, red teaming, blue teaming, et cetera, et cetera. So that paradigm is coming into AI testing too, because you want to make sure that, people are not trying to steal your model. People are not trying to poison your model. People are not trying to get back an answer which they want based on specific kinds of prompts. So all these are tests which needs to be done. It's not only sufficient for you to kind of integrate your system to a large language model, it's also important for you to understand, well, where will this model fail? And what should we what should we be doing about it? So recently, Air Canada had an incident when there was someone who was trying to rebook a flight, and they got back a message saying that this is the policy. And when this person rebooked the flight using that particular policy, later he got billed. And then when he asked, well, that was not a policy we have. It's the chatbot which made up a policy. It hallucinated and made up a policy about rebooking. And then they went to the courts, and the court said, well, even though it was a chatbot which gave an answer, the chatbot was representing you as an organization, so you should cover those costs. So whenever you give investment advice and something bad happens, so you are still responsible. You got to do your testing to make sure that you're not just integrating a system and letting it go in the wild. On the other hand, there are all these newer attacks. Whenever there are things which are possible, there are going to be like crooks who are going to try and see, well, can we game the system and try and do interesting things? So a lot of interesting attacks which are coming in. So people are realizing like, well, these models are not perfect, and you could game the system, you could see interesting results. And it becomes a question of, well, how comfortable are you to deploy these systems within an enterprise? Which means that you have to not only understand the use cases, but also put in guardrails, both preemptively. So if a user is asking a specific question and it's not something you should be answering, you want to prevent the question from even going to the engine in the first place. And then once the answer comes out, you should be comfortable enough to give that answer to your end user. So how do you put those guardrails is the big system engineering question a lot of companies are having. So it's not as easy. The reason why I started out with ChatGPT and we are kind of going into all these issues are, you're thinking about systems engineering here. It's not just ChatGPT, everybody just asking a question and getting back a response. You're thinking about building systems which are specific to use cases and specific to different contexts so that you can understand the possibilities and make sure that it's vetted out for particular use cases. And that's extremely important in the financial industry. And last year, we ran a roundtable with 15 companies with another company called Truera. And one of the things which a lot of companies came down and talked about the various controls they have. A lot of people were uncomfortable deploying these systems into production still, because once we deploy this into production, we need to be reliably able to say this is exactly how it's going to perform. And many times we're not there yet. The innovation is happening so fast. So despite all the testing, we are not 100% there yet. So a lot of companies are still hesitating putting things into production. For things wherein there's a lot of data and a lot of examples, it does really well. So for example, if you're going to ask what's the capital of the United States, there are hundreds of thousands of documents on the web, which basically has a reliable answer, and it'll say Washington, D.C. very easily. But if you ask a very intricate mathematical question with a lot of logic inbuilt into it, then it may not be able to do it. So for reasoning and planning kinds of problems, it's not really good at it. It'll make up stuff. So the question becomes like, for what kinds of issues can you potentially use these applications, and where should you be thinking about putting adequate guardrails, or probably not even have large language models answer those questions for you. The second aspect was leveraging things like coding, because a lot of effort is spent in building out code bases, and companies are seeing that in the next few years, we're going to have so many design patterns. So in order to generate your first draft of your code, most likely you will use a large language model rather than you writing things from scratch. So they are seeing that a whole profession is going to be absorbed by the changing dynamics of how people write code in the near future. So we are seeing a lot of interesting innovations happening in there. So the question becomes, what will you build using generative AI? Okay, so if you're interested further, we have this full day program coming up on April, and we'll talk a lot about the different design patterns, building out some case studies using retrieval augmented search, also leveraging LangChain and other packages for building out end-to-end systems. And we'll also have some real-world use case studies, one for looking at call transcripts. And we just finished another case study on parsing and interpreting FOMC minutes from the Fed. So we'll show you some examples on how to build these systems from scratch and how to interface with it. So with that, I will stop here. We also have a whole program on machine learning and artificial intelligence risk management, and we partner with Premier to do that. So if you're interested, you can go to our website and check out the answers. So I will pause in here and take a few questions. I know there are certain questions coming out from people. Do you have any questions in the room? So we can start there, and then we can answer questions from people who are online. Yes, Christine.
Thank you for the presentation. Bringing this to a little bit higher level.
Sure.
If you're suggesting someone like manager of the asset management organization and no computer science background.
Sure.
What would be your top 3 advice, either broadly or something specific?
Advice for
how to do it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, you need to have a use case. I mean, you can't just think about okay, I want to use AI for using AI's sake, right? So you got to have a particular use case, and you got to then define, why am I going to be interested in using AI? So one is potentially there is, you're building new products, you hadn't thought about before. You're building new experiences. You're enhancing the experience on how you interface with, for example, retirement systems, right? The report you get, it's been more or less the same for the last 20 years. I mean, most people don't even open up their performance reports at the end of the month because they don't really get much, information. You probably need to be a financial analyst to understand things better. So there are possibilities you could use to, create the stickiness, to understand your end users better, to enable them with tooling so that they can make real decisions, right? So that is one way to look at it. The other thing is, these are systems, as I mentioned, which are completely not, foolproof. So you have to do a lot of testing. So even though you're really excited about it and saying, okay, let's just deploy something, if you do not have the right risk management methodologies and testing methodologies, you will not be able to get a successful product in production. So which means that there has to not only be a mandate, but also the required amount of resources and funding to make sure that you're building your end-to-end systems well. It's just a matter of time when we are going to see these innovations. I mean, the way the world is going, this is not something as as hype which comes in and goes. We are seeing a lot of true business value companies are realizing, and the winners will be able to do things. So which means that you got to strategize on what's our place 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and what is our current core competency, and how do we build the deltas and the required skill sets so that we can actually prepare for the next generation of these systems. Yeah. Any other questions? Yep. If you have questions online, please type it in the Q&A panel. I have a question in here. Michaela, please type your question. So I'll answer that for you. So how can banks confirm the security of the data with OpenAI type API or API call applications? So that's a great question. There is the SLA which OpenAI says for certain things that your data will not be used for training purposes in certain cases. So, but the question is, what else can they use your data for? To understand what kinds of questions are coming in. It may not be used for training, but may be used for other things. That's one aspect. The other thing to note is, when you're sending data, you're probably also, depending on the way that your networks are structured, you may be sending a lot of back and forth. So there may be other security loopholes wherein you may not have engineered your systems properly. And that could potentially have some kind of leakage of your information from your companies. So it's always a bad idea to take proprietary information and send it to these large language models to get back responses. So in case you're really, really concerned about the security of your data, well, the best thing to do is like host your large language models locally. And like with open source models, that way you're not sending anything out of your firewalls. Azure AI, they have instances wherein you can go in and get GPT-4 or 3.5 running in their infrastructure, but you are creating a specific channel and you're not directly accessing the OpenAI's publicly available API. So there are ways in which you can potentially engineer your systems to do things, but ultimately, anything which is private should not be sent out, at least at this point, without the required guardrails and testing. So there's another question. What is the most or minimum cost or maximum efficiency effective LLM and framework, LangChain, for tabular number extraction from PDFs? I think it's a very generic question, Venetia, because it has to be looked at the use case. In fact, we have built out a whole pipeline to process PDFs. And it's not a simple problem because there's a lot of information depending on the kind of PDF, because PDFs may have images, may have tables, and you may want to chunk it in specific ways. So for structured PDF files, you may have to follow a different procedure. For PDF files with a lot of context and images, you may have to follow a different procedure. So you may have to do a lot of engineering to get your PDF processing right. So in fact, we built out our own PDF processing pipeline. We are leveraging two different systems. So we run it through one system, extract some data. We run it through another system, extract some images, and then we kind of sew them together and we build our own map to kind of connect all the pieces which we have extracted. And then contextually, when we need to use it, we build out the whole thing. So we're building out our own workflow to do it. So you have to think about it, like why you're doing it and what is the utility out of doing the whole thing. Okay. So there are a couple of questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to try and go down. So Vijay has a question. Do you have a decision tree to help articulate when Gen AI can be used and when not? Vijay, that's a great question. I would actually not start with whether we should be using Gen AI or not. I should start with what is the problem I'm trying to solve and whether Gen AI could potentially help me in this particular problem. Because unless you have a context in mind, you will not be able to create a decision tree. And the decision tree may come back with an answer saying, okay, Gen AI has benefits, but benefits at what cost? Because if you are going to be spending even a couple of pennies on the dollar to answer a question, and you're getting hundreds of thousands of questions, then you have to think about it as an engineering problem. So how do I make sure that I engineer my system so that I don't recreate the answers again and again and again? I may have to do some caching. I may have to think about like leveraging answers which has already been created and cluster some of them and then potentially use the already answered questions as a base for answering new questions. So there are a lot of design patterns you have to think about as you're building it out. So unfortunately, there's no decision tree, but there is a possibility wherein you can engineer these systems to come up with this. So Satyaki has another question. What are the trends in model governance in Gen AI and newer ML models? Because models are now more interconnected with data management and process management and security issues. So I'm writing a book on artificial intelligence risk management. So, wait for the book and we will talk about many of the model governance related issues out there. But if you're tracking things, you can look at the NIST framework. You can look at the EU AI Act, which is talking about some of these governance related issues. You can also look at some of the ISO publications, which has a lot of coverage on testing and validation and things like that. But I would say start with the SR 11.7, which is like probably one of the most well-documented, document in the context of risk management for models. And many a times for AI, you could still build upon the foundation there and then think about like what else should we be doing with respect to AI. So that is probably the one thing. The one thing I would hesitate recommending is buying off the shelf third-party governance systems, wherein you just plug and play and say, okay, there's a cloud hosted, GRC system, which has been designed for some generic purpose. And because you want to do AI risk management, you're just going to plug your models into it. Because I've had a client who said they were working with 100 models. And then because of the permutations and combinations of different models and the way they are designing the models for different consumer bases and different states and different cities, etc., that's exploding to 1,000 models. Now, just plugging all these things into a third-party system is not going to work. So you have to design some aspects, and you will be able to use multiple tools, but unless you have a real good handle about like what your organization structure is, how many resources do you have, and what aspects of it should be automated, and what aspects of it is something you're doing just for compliance reasons, you should start thinking about model governance as a holistic process rather than just another, system-related aspect. Okay, so there are a couple of other questions. We'll try to see how many we can answer. Michaela has a question. When doing a financial advice, do you disclose to the client that it's been done by ChatGPT? Absolutely. If you are leveraging ChatGPT, even for some kind of a draft purpose, I mean, I would not write at the end of a letter of invitation saying this was generated by ChatGPT. It's the first draft. I'm leveraging an assistant and I'm getting it out. But if you're going to be doing research, and if the research is going to be using ChatGPT, you should be disclosing it. We actually had an instance which on LinkedIn we were sharing with a couple of other colleagues. You can look it up. There was a publication in Elsewhere, I think. They have a paper wherein the first line of the abstract or the summary of the paper is, yes, here is a possible introduction to the topic. So that is the first line. So the whole abstract or the summary was generated by ChatGPT. And this was peer-reviewed, reviewed by an editor, published in a reputed journal, has like 4 authors, and it's such a big reputation risk if something bad happens. So you should definitely disclose if you're going to be doing financial advice using ChatGPT. But again, the value add we as humans bring is we can understand the context. Everything may not be automated, but if you are planning to give advice, you need to bound it so that you can say, well, it's leveraging these pieces of information, and also put in disclosure documents so that people know whether to take the advice for sure or not. Secondly, there's another question. Do you see a possibility of APIs getting mirrored and used to cause disruptions and theft of data for even open source LLMs? Well, so that's a great question. A lot of companies are now building out open source models, and for training, they're using ChatGPT as for question answers to even train those models. So there's a lot of commingling of data and aspects happening. So I don't know about disruptions, but there is going to be, the world with the way we are generating data. The first iterations, so the first few iterations, we are leveraging all the data we have online, and we are building out these models. But as we grow these models and start creating newer and newer publications, for example, the paper I mentioned, right? So what in case the next 30 to 40% of the data which was created available on the web was all created by large language models? So many a times you may have to now sift through what is real and what isn't. So that is something you will have to deal with as you go. And that's why specific applications within companies using like a RAG-based framework or even building your own fine-tuned model may be the way to go rather than leveraging just generic open source or custom large language models. You have to build a system from scratch. So there's a question on human in the loop. At what level the system permits human feedback? So that's a great question. You have to, anything we are building, leveraging AI, we have a human in the loop, especially for high-risk use cases, especially when there is financial data or technical data involved. You need to have a human in the loop. We do not have, the systems there yet, wherein you could say that, I'm delegating everything to the machine and the machines are going to be able to do it. So it's always, as a part of your design, making sure that all the critical junctures wherein someone needs to review and sign off, even if it's a review task, to sign off saying that I am okay with this particular answer. Otherwise, we will be dealing with these tail use cases, which we have never thought about, and then we'll have to address it as we go. There might be some malicious users who may want to impair the integrity of the system. So I wonder at what level the system should permit human in this. You can definitely prompt engineer some feedback, but you need to have formal guardrails, because even though you have prompts, the large language models may ignore those prompts. I mean, we have seen many cases wherein we say, do this specific thing, and the large language model ignores it and gives you a result wherein it has ignored your instructions completely. So you should have guardrails afterwards to make sure that the answer which is coming out actually makes sense, and you can share it with your end user. Can you arrange such a short workout on chunking strategy, particularly for the financial industry? Yeah, so this workshop, which is available online, it's primarily geared to the financial industry. We are doing here at the CFA Boston offices. But if you have a particular need for a specific cohort group, just reach out to us through our website, and we'd be happy to get back to you. And then Benicia, I think she talks about tabular data. Thank you for a response. I mean, it doesn't matter whether the data is tabular or free form. You should still be able to process information. Okay, Lawrence, thank you for the interesting session, and have a nice day, everyone. Appreciate the feedback, Lawrence. Michaela, relying on large language models can be viewed as being lazy or not qualified. The model might not be totally wrong, and the advisor loses his skill, like being always driven and using software for directions. People lose their ability to learn maps. That's a great insight, Michaela, and I think she continues, if the client knows that the advisor uses ChatGPT, why not experiment himself and not pay the advisor? If the client pays for the experience and expertise, you are cheating with ChatGPT. I'm here the devil's advocate. That's a great question, Michaela. Now, one of the things to think about is high net worth individuals can afford to have financial advisors, and that will continue to be the case. I mean, many a times if we want to go, and you can go to a grocery store, buy the ingredients and cook, or go to a restaurant, or you can have a chef come to your house and cook. There are various ways in which you can actually make your dinner. Now, high net worth individuals could potentially say, you know what, I'm going to only go with financial advisors who are not going to be using ChatGPT. But the question is, you're not using ChatGPT for giving you the advice. Financial advisor is not putting your whole portfolio and saying, what advice should I be giving this particular customer? They may be using research tools which leverage ChatGPT. They may not be qualified with SQL, but in order to search for particular assets which meet the required criteria, they may be expressing, saying, show me a bond which has this particular duration, this particular convexity, has this particular coupon rate, has these particular characteristics, and they may be creating a search query in English, and the large language model is using that to create a SQL prompt and filtering back the results. So they may be using it as a research tool, like what I talked about in the Morgan Stanley example. If you're going to be doing recommendations based on ChatGPT, well, you're using a generic large language model to do things which it's not qualified to do. So you should take the blame, because the results may not be proper. On the other hand, you could also think about a financial innovation wherein you are leveraging, different pairs of, contexts of different users and the most appropriate portfolio for them. And if you have a really good training data set, you could fine tune your model, and the model could be really good at giving specific predictions for a particular use case. So if you have innovated that kind of a model and you're using that and you disclose it, it could be to your advantage. You're actually using technology which can enhance your decision-making skills rather than just using a shortcut to get back a generic answer. So if anything, even with maps, right? So if I do not put in the right coordinates or do not put in the right specifications, it'll just give me a map for a particular location. It is my duty as a human to make sure that I'm not going to the wrong neighborhood, right? So it is always the responsibility of the financial advisor to disclose and also to make sure that if they are using tools, to understand the tools, both the opportunities and the risks, and make sure that you are generating the answers appropriately. Okay, so I think that's all the time we have. We have gone over a little bit, but hopefully this discussion was helpful. And if you are interested in joining us for the full day workshop, the details are here. And hopefully I'll see many of you back in the workshop next month. And if there are any questions, feel free to reach out to me over LinkedIn or by email, sri@quantuniversity.com. So thank you again for showing up, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you.